Hi, dear ones. I'm Amy Rose White, integrative psychotherapist. So glad to have you with me today. So let's talk about the enduring effects of childhood abuse and neglect. And I'm primarily going to focus on four that are really about how our relationships are impacted by childhood abuse and neglect and what that looks like, and then a brief primer on what to do that is actually extremely powerful and life-changing. So be sure and see this video all the way through to the end. Now, a lot of us don't think of ourselves as survivors of childhood abuse or neglect. I can't tell you how many folks I've worked with that generally report having a great childhood, love their parents, feel perhaps an even very close relationship to one or both of them in adulthood. And yet, as we dig deeper and go along, as the person, as the client becomes more and more attuned to what is really going on emotionally, sometimes a different story emerges. And this does not have to mean that you were beaten physically, that you were sexually abused, that you were even ever called names. Abuse and neglect or other forms of trauma can be extremely subtle. And it's one of the reasons that we have so much wounding and hurting and kind of wacky behavior out in the world, is that so many of us, I know I'm jaded, but I sort of feel like it's the vast majority of us, just did not get major emotional needs met in childhood because our parents were doing the very best they could given what they did not receive either. So what does that mean? We end up re-injuring each other. And the folks that I work with, and I know that's you if you're watching this video, are people who are really dedicated in understanding that process in themselves better so that they do not repeat it with the people they love in their lives, especially if they choose to have kids. So let's talk about, for our purposes, just generally, that there's been some sort of major need to be seen, to be understood, to feel safe, to feel loved unconditionally that wasn't met in your childhood. These are some of the major ways that you can actually know that maybe something wasn't missed if you aren't really sure yet. And for those of you that do know, there were some hard things, but maybe you've kind of swept it aside and you've said, I'm past it. That was a long time ago. I've moved through it. These are some of the key areas that you might want to focus on and just evaluate, take an inventory and say to yourself, is this something that's still showing up? And that all that is, friends, is simply an invitation into deeper healing and deeper self-love around those spaces, those tender areas around our hearts. So number one, a false self. The false self develops in the child through something we call projective identification. And that is a fancy word for when a parent takes the qualities that they don't like about themselves, sees them in the child instead because it is too painful for them, and projects that insecurity onto the child. Now, it's not always negative. Sometimes it might be a message like, you're so lazy, or you'll never amount to anything, or you're selfish. Children are supposed to be selfish. FYI, that's their job. That's something we hopefully outgrow into adulthood. And if you're the victim of abuse or neglect in childhood, that can be somewhere people get stuck. That's what's called narcissism. That's another video that I've done in the past. However, we can also be experiencing projective identification from a parent or other caregiver that was primary in your life for something positive. It might be, oh, you're so helpful, every time you cook dinner or clean for me, like I don't know what I'd do without you. That's another projective identification, which is a form of manipulation. It's putting something that the person either has or wishes they had the ability to have onto someone else. So it can go both ways, but most people experience it in a negative sense. So just to give an example, in your day-to-day life, have you ever had a friend that starts talking about their weight and then maybe they ask you about yours? Or, hey, did you, do something different to your hair? And if you're insecure about it, you might actually experience them projecting their insecurities onto you. And then it sort of becomes this two-way street where you're both feeling worse about yourself. That's an example of projective identification. But in the worst sense of it, the child basically believes the negative stuff the parent is telling them. And that can even happen through neglect. It might not be directly stated. So if your parents just kind of didn't pay attention to you, weren't there for long periods of time, didn't show up at important events in your life, or perhaps they said lots of negative stuff about it, or just emotionally weren't there, but maybe they showed up to those things, but emotionally they were gone, the child will believe that that is their fault. So they'll take on the emotional absence of that parent and develop a false sense of self based on feeling shame and inadequacy and low self-worth because of the neglect or because of the abuse. They have no choice but to determine that the way they're being treated must be their fault. So a false sense of self is developed that is all about protecting that child from that terrible pain. So that might be to become the perfect kid. It might be to engage in all the behaviors you're told that you are guilty of, to be the troublemaker, to be the one who's only getting negative attention. It can look a million different ways, but essentially what is key and very damaging about it is a child doesn't develop a sense of their own experience, their own bodily awareness, their own interests and personality. It's all about basically getting worth from the outside based on trying to internalize what the parent is projecting onto them, or simply creating a story about who they are that's false based on not achieving or not receiving any of those really basic needs to be seen and heard and attuned to. And something we call affective attunement is a really important concept in psychotherapy and mental health, because it's the way we help a child develop a sense of what is actually going on in their inner world and understand themselves and their emotions and regulate themselves, their body, their reactions, their responses, and their internal emotional state. And if you don't experience affective attunement, where someone basically picks you up and says, "You look really sad. I am so sorry. That was scary. You fell down," or "That person just screamed at you and that must have felt terrible," or "You look really worried right now. That was scary when that car came really close to you." If a child gets a lot of those messages, they can organize their emotional experience, which was, yes, anxiety, fear, sadness, jealousy, whatever it was. It helps them make sense of it and organize it in a coherent way. So the child starts to begin to develop a sense of safety in the body, safety in relationships, and then their own individual nature can bloom forth, how they like to talk, what they like to talk about, what they're interested in life, what they think is funny. But when that affective attunement is missing and there is neglect, an absence of it, or abuse, so you get the opposite reaction: "Stop your crying. There's nothing to cry about. You're too sensitive." That's one a lot of my clients hear often. "You're too much, take it down. You're crying crocodile tears." When the child hears that enough, they will simply develop a false identity to avoid the pain of that, from all of that negative projecting. And that leads us to number 2. Very common for folks who have experienced childhood abuse or neglect to be people pleasers. Now, people pleasing is really a reflection of this lack of identity and lack of another term, throwing a lot of fancy mental health terms at you today, because I think it's very helpful to have some labels for some of these concepts. That lack of identity is a lack of what we call ego strength. And ego strength is really because, by the way, the ego is not the enemy here, folks. All the meditating and spiritual conversations we have about the ego being false, yeah, the ego can cause a lot of problems, and an over-identification with it doesn't help us. But a healthy ego steps in and says, "Hey, don't talk to my kid that way." Healthy ego, that's another video I did about walking out of my dentist's office recently. If you haven't watched that, I'll put a link in the about section for this video. A healthy ego says, "Yes, I'm a good person. I'm a worthwhile person. I love myself, and I'm going to make choices in the world that reflect that and hopefully be of service to others." We need our egos as human beings to just function in daily life. But that lack of ego strength lends itself to people pleasing because of its relationship to the false sense of, how do I feel a sense of power, safety, and control in life if I don't really know who I am? So that all results in behavior that is saying yes when you really mean no, morphing your personality and interests and even mannerisms, perhaps even style of dress, to the people around you to feel like you are making them happy or fitting in somehow. Basically, it leads to self-abandonment, people pleasing, because we really are focused on the other rather than what pleases us. And that's not selfish, that's just knowing thyself. So a lot of us who've had experiences childhood wounding, we just don't know ourselves until we do this deeper work. Now, when you're people pleasing, you're unaware of your own needs and you're essentially over focused on the needs of others just to feel that sense of importance and worth and connection and value. Now, unfortunately, that results in number 3, which is often a high tolerance for chaos, poor behavior, and neglect and abuse in future relationships. Now, I'm telling you, you can have no overt abuse where no one said an unkind word to you, but if you had a sick parent on the couch all day and another parent that was gone working, you will have an internal state of fear in childhood because that's no structure and no effective attunement that I was just talking about. So you might choose relationships that replicate that sense of I'm alone and I'm scared and panicked, which we overcompensate for by not having needs and taking care of everything ourselves. This phenomenon around chaos and poor behavior, if it means where we attract and choose relationships that are really toxic, really negative for us, make us feel bad about ourselves, maybe there's a lot of fighting, a lot of constant need for arguing, and just really icky feeling stuff. Those of us that experience childhood abuse and neglect will tend to feel very comfortable in that because of something called drift. So if you experienced, say, parents that were fighting all the time, yelling, hitting, slamming doors, throwing things. Maybe one person would leave for hours or days at a time. That's another form of child abuse that we don't talk about it enough. So maybe you don't think you were abused, but you witnessed a lot of emotional toxicity and dysfunction and conflict in your life. That drift phenomenon is that frogs in boiling water story, if you've ever heard it. If you throw a frog in boiling water, it will jump out and say, oh, this is not for me. But if you put it in water and you slowly turn up the heat, and that by that metaphor is childhood. So the child just gets used to the hotter and hotter water, the frogs will actually let themselves die. They'll be boiled to death because it's slow. So the drift phenomenon will happen in adult relationships for those of us that have had these really painful experiences simply because we've adapted. Now, it's wonderful to be adaptable and flexible in our thinking. However, if when you're hearing this, you're thinking, I might have adapted to some pretty crappy, you know what I almost said, behavior in others, that might be because you have survived drift in your childhood and it's just totally normal to you. So you almost won't even notice. And if you do think that there's poor behavior going on, you'll tend to blame yourself because of that childhood experience of egocentricity, where if there's neglect or abuse going on, the child has no other choice but to say it must be me. That is a normal developmental conclusion. And it also helps the child feel more safe and in control, because if there's someone to blame, that is themselves, that is actually a more powerful position than recognizing that the people that you are most dependent on to live, to survive, can't do it and are potentially even dangerous. So this leads to this core belief called, I'll just take what I can get. So be thinking about how you've chosen your friendships, how you've chosen your significant other relationships. Have you taken what you can get because you have just been in the hot, boiling water for so long, maybe all of your life? Now that leads us to number 4, a fear of intimacy. So the idea is, as human beings, we're wired to connect, we're wired to love, we are wired to be needy. It is normal to have needs, people. We are wired to love, essentially. A wonderful book by that same name, Wired for Love, Stan Tatkin. I'll put the link in the video. So we will want that, but we will be very afraid of either chaos and abuse or abandonment. So the very thing that we want the most, we will tend to pull it and push it and pull it and push it, or attract people who do that. So they remind us of the very hot water that we grew up in. And essentially, we believe that our power and control will come from, again, meeting all of our own needs and or simply not having them in a relationship. Now, in the beginning of a relationship, you can, it's all fun and people are on their best behavior. But as the intimacy deepens or gets real, the neediness in our heart begins to show. And that will typically activate a strong desire to run or to onto the person so they don't go. And especially if you had caregivers that were maybe sometimes consistent and kind, and then they would leave or then suddenly be abusive and mean, and you kind of never knew which one you were going to get, intimacy will feel very threatening because it is so vulnerable. And that's why, for those of us that have histories of abuse and neglect, even subtle forms really benefit from working this out in the therapeutic setting with a safe person who can help us actually understand how it even feels to be seen, how it even feels to be heard and listened to, and get that affective attunement. So that's really the good news, is all of this can be healed, but not without intention and, frankly, some hard work, some really deep soul searching. So how do we heal this? Essentially, the larger goal of any work you do, whether that's on your own, you're reading blogs, you're watching videos, you're reading some workbooks, you're working with a therapist or a coach, however that looks for you, essentially the healing of trauma, the healing around relationships that results from abuse and neglect in childhood is all about bringing awareness to your patterns, but primarily awareness back to the body's breath, and the body's emotional state. So if you've experienced any childhood wounding, I guarantee you will have drifted out. So you're in the hot water, drifting, getting used to this like chaos and crappy feeling all the time. But you've also drifted out of your physical experience. So healing is about really slowing down, noticing when you're having an interaction in relationships. And this can be coworker, friend, boss, lover, marital partner, whomever you might feel some emotional intensity around or in your body, but you just are trying to manage it all the time or think through the problem. That's another really common indicator of someone that didn't get their needs met in childhood, is they think their feelings rather than feel their feelings. Slowing down the breath, coming back into the body, being willing to be honest with how we feel, and then becoming willing to act and change your behavior. And choose people, places, and situations that reflect the new growing respect and self-trust you have with you. That's how that happens as we heal. Now that might sound really overwhelming, and you might be thinking, how do I begin? And I'll be continuing along my YouTube journey describing these in detail. And of course, I encourage you to seek professional help if any of these things are ringing bells for you. But the important take home is you do deserve unconditional love. You do deserve utter respect at all times. And if people blow it in your life, they get to stay if they come back and take ownership and responsibility and truly, genuinely apologize. And an apology is only as good as is changed behavior. So as we make different choices in relationships, beginning with the one we have with ourselves, being kinder and more respectful and compassionate to us, that begins to translate out in our lives. Things change, different people show up, and more importantly, that respect and self-love and trust grows and grows and grows, and we begin to feel less at the whim of what other people are doing in general. And free to have truly healthy, satisfying relationships with people who can see us and do think we're great, warts and all. And that's what you deserve. And that is my wish for you. Until next time, And please let me know what you think about in the comments. Thanks for sharing this video. Thank you for liking. Thank you for sharing. But until next time, may you be happy. May you be well. May you be at peace. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.